This is Fit to Succeed in partnership with NordicFitnessEducation.com with host Ben Pratt.
Is sugar really public health enemy number one? What happens when we consume sugar? How does it affect our health? What about consuming fruit sugar versus other types of processed sugar? Is sugar to blame for the obesity crisis? All this and more answered in today's podcast. Hello and welcome to another Fit to Succeed podcast. Today I'm super excited. I have a friend and colleague, a man by the name of Richard Scrivener here with us. Hi Richard, how are you?
Hey Ben, how's it going, mate? Yeah, really good. Good to have a chat with you again. It's been a little while.
It has indeed, it has. I'm excited to be able to take a bit of time to pick your brain. Richard and I got to know each other perhaps well over a decade ago. We worked for the same training company, and Richard and I over the years have evolved a great friendship, but also spent a lot of time talking about all kinds of things, specifically on the subject of nutrition. And we often have some really in-depth conversations. So I'd like to share that sort of conversation and insight with you, the listeners. So Richard, great to have that chance to talk to you today, specifically about sugar.
Yeah, always good to chew the fat and, well, not chew the fat today, but chew the carbs, I guess.
Today is indeed chewing the carbs, specifically sugar. No. Richard, you've been a fitness professional for a long time, perhaps more than 15 years or beyond, I would have thought. And you've invested an awful lot of time in learning about the subject of nutrition, something that's very close to my heart. I love to read and to study about that subject as well. Now, in particular, as a fitness professional, what was it that motivated you to get into that subject, perhaps much more than the typical fitness professional?
Yeah, there's probably more selfish reasons right at the beginning. I had a good run up at the fitness industry. I started when I was about 15, 16 in the gym. Skinny young boy, and all you want to do is get in there and try and build a little bit of muscle. And obviously with the weight training, you can't really separate out making gains and not have a nutrition component to that. So, as always, it starts off by chatting to the bros, trying to find out what works. Your first question is, what protein shake to buy from Holland and Barrett? And that's where it all started from there. You just sort of get a bit of an interest. You want to look at what supplements are working. And then as you become a little bit more educated, I think you start to evolve that mindset, whereas it's not just about aesthetically how do you look, but it's about how you can nourish your body, how you can improve your health, how you can improve longevity. And then when you start working with clients, you've got no choice really but to spot up on nutrition, because if it's not a training question, it's definitely going to be a nutrition question that your clients are throwing at you. And I think nutrition's a massive piece of the puzzle. It's 50% of the puzzle. So, there's an obligatory need to have some understanding of nutrition, but more so than that, I'm just a little bit of a nerd. I love all things science. As you know, from our discussions, we can get going, Ben, can't we? We can have some serious discussions on these, which has a scientific sort of foundation to it. And I just love the fascination of what the body's capable of, what it needs, what it can do, how it can evolve, how it can adapt. And I just think it's we're a fascinating organism, and nutrition is a big part of that. It has some quite profound effects, doesn't it, on our health, our performance. So I think the more we can understand about it, the better. But equally, it's important not to get too bogged down by the details. And I think that can easily happen in nutrition. You've got to do that. You've got to dive into the rabbit hole a little bit, but you've got to come straight back out and then take a big look at things and make sure that what you're trying to learn about and what you understand isn't clouding your judgment with respect to how it fits within the bigger picture. So yeah, I guess that's why I like nutrition so much.
Oh, that's a great introduction, actually, because I think it gives us a nice sense of what you're like as an individual, because you're definitely somebody who likes to get into the detail. But I've also found that you are good, as you said, at stepping back and then looking at the big picture and going, does this actually make sense? Is this evidence or this data accurate? And I think that's going to serve us well in our discussion today about sugar. Now, there's no doubt, Richard, that over the last few years, perhaps the last 3 or 4 years in particular, the subject of sugar has really been hitting the headlines in the media an awful lot. And if there's anything that's happened perhaps over those last 4 years, it's been this shift from fat being public enemy number one in the nutrition world to sugar now being this public enemy number one. Perhaps to frame this whole conversation, let's just get down to the basics. Perhaps you could explain for our listeners what the basic biochemistry of sugar.
Yeah, for sure. And, that point's a great point you make there, Ben, because this is a classic example, isn't it, of getting into the rabbit hole and focusing so much on one nutrient that you just fail to see the wood for the trees. And now all of a sudden you've got one enemy and then the buck passes to the other. So yeah, right off the bat, that's another classic example that you can just lose context. But that said, carbohydrates are relatively important as a nutritional compound, I guess. We've got the family of carbohydrates. You can break those down into complex carbs, which effectively are starch and fiber. And you've got simple carbohydrates, which effectively are sugars. So if we're talking about fiber in the body as a human, we struggle to digest that and extract energy from it. Our gut bacteria may work on that a little bit. But fiber is pretty important from a digestive health perspective. The starch component is where we are accessing a lot of our energy from. So starch will be a chain of single sugars that's of varying lengths. And when we eat those starches from the food, they'll be digested into their smallest components, which are the single and the double sugars. Or you can ingest carbohydrate as a sugar form. So it's already as a single and double sugar. And therefore it makes it very quick to absorb and get into the system. And that's probably one of the areas where sugar takes a little bit of a beating, because when you have sugar as a readily available source of energy, and it's in a very simplified format, it's been highly processed, highly refined, and you've got single, double sugars instead of these long chains that are also packaged up with the fiber, with the water, with all of the other micronutrients and phytonutrients, you're effectively left with something that's quite void of anything else other than pure energy. So the body can quickly, readily take that on, and therefore we have just a source of nutrition that doesn't give us much other than just energy.
I think that's a really good point, Richard, because if you were to go onto a nutritional analysis site and to look at sucrose, white table sugar, there literally is no other nutrition in it. It is just 4 calories of energy. There's no vitamins, no minerals. It has a nutritional score of 0 effectively. So, that is an important point. It kind of makes us realize, well, if there is so little to it, it is just kind of a molecule of calories. Why is it causing so much problem? I mean, what are the primary health concerns with regards to consuming too much sugar?
I suppose you can look at it from different perspectives. So you can look at it from a micronutrient perspective, and that's the way I try and break things down. So exactly like you just said, there isn't much that comes along with pure sugar, if that's what we're going to call it. So other than just the calorie value, there's not much there at all. And this is where you start to get into big debates around whole foods versus processed foods. Because if you look at something like fruit, for example, whilst fruit contains a lot of sugar, and a lot of those sugars are simple sugars, I think people get into the bad habits of always assuming a simple sugar is negative for health, and that's something that we should avoid. But fruit has a lot of simple sugars in it. But alongside of that, it's packed full of, amazing stuff. There's vitamins, minerals, phytochemicals. And I read just the other day that so far we've discovered in the region of 5,000 to 10,000 different phytochemicals or phytonutrients. There's probably a lot still out there that we haven't discovered. And there's a lot of interesting ongoing research that we don't really know how a lot of these phytonutrients are interacting within our body. They're regulators of switching on and off genes. I mean, really powerful stuff. And it's undoubted that we'll find more as time goes on. So if we're talking about why is sugar unhealthy, we first of all got to separate that out from sugar or energy that is void of other nutrients versus simple sugars that have a lot of good stuff with them, i.e. fruit. So I think that's one of the first things, that you've got nothing else to offer the body other than just energy. And if anything, the body's going to use its own resources, its own vitamins and mineral content to start handling and dealing with that sugar. And if we're not also topping those nutrient levels up through whole foods, so those nutrients that come along with the whole foods, then we're actually stripping the body to some extent of its own natural resources. So I think that's one way to start looking at it. I think another way to look at it is sugar is highly palatable. And there's a term that I really like that gets thrown around a lot in nutrition these days when we're talking about good versus bad foods. And that's this idea of hyperpalatability.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I know you know this really well, Ben, but when you're looking at a mix of nutrients, and especially when you're looking at fat, you're looking at sugars, and you're looking at salt. When you bundle those things up in just the right ratios, I mean, they become hyper palatable to the extent that you can gobble down hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of calories in one sitting. And it doesn't even touch the sides. It doesn't even really register that strongly within the body. In as far as we are now packed full of energy, stop eating. There's a real play there with something called, we can look at this idea of homeostatic eating versus hedonic eating, where if you listen really carefully to your body's internal cues, you should be able to quite well self-regulate the amount of food that you eat. But what we know is that lots of people have problems with their internal biochemistry, their health, their hormonal axes, and all these different things that's thrown out, and we can't detect the hunger cues that we otherwise, should be able to, and therefore it's quite easy for us to overeat.
Is that what you mean? Is that what you mean, Richard? Sorry to interrupt. Is that what you mean by homeostatic eating? That there's mechanisms in the body that control our feelings of hunger and how much we eat and when we feel we should stop?
Yeah, exactly that. That's exactly what it is. But then opposed to that, you've also got hedonic eating, which is, people just eating for the joy, the pleasure of it. We've got those neurotransmitter pathways in the brain linked to dopamine and serotonin. And, a lot of foods that we eat trigger those responses, activate the reward centers in the brain. And so we want to eat. And this is all circling back to this hyper palatability factor, which is foods that have and sugar. This is why sugar isn't necessarily to blame for all of the poor negative health consequences, because when sugar on its own is eaten in small, relatively appropriate amounts, let's use that term, then it's not necessarily a problem. But mix it up with lots of other foods that cause a situation where we're likely to overeat. That's where the problem is. So I think you've got that micronutrient, being devoid of micronutrients. You've got the play and the messing around with the homeostatic mechanisms in the body, the hedonic eating that it promotes. And then also with respect to appetite as well. I think sugar and carbohydrates in general are not so satiating. So right. What we can understand as well is that, in the body, in the gut especially, we've got various peptides, various hormones that are released to tell us that nutrients have arrived. And protein is the number one macronutrient when it comes to satiation. So you can eat protein and very quickly you feel quite full and you feel quite satisfied. And to some extent fat has an effect as well, but carbohydrate is not so strong at doing that, especially when it's just sugar, because going back to our previous point, if you take away water and you take away fiber, and those things are also quite satiating because they fill the stomach, they expand the stomach space. That in itself is a mechanical stimulus to stop eating and to recognize that we're full and we're good to go. Take those things away and leave yourself with just a pure sugar source, then you've stripped away all of the factors that would otherwise help regulate the amount of food that you would otherwise want to take in. And therefore, again, there's no stimulus to stop the intake of sugar. So sit there and munch your way through a bag of Skittles, no problems at all. You're going to be able to do that and take on 300, 400, 500 calories, no problem.
Yeah, I think that plays really nicely when you think historically, or you look at cultures that have had some sugar intake. It's very limited because before we could process sugar out of plants, the only place we would get it would be fruit and honey. But if you look at like tribes, indigenous tribes that would find honey, they would literally gorge on it because it was such a rare treat. And so they'd have a lot, but then that would be it. And they might not have it again for months and months. Whereas we're in the case today where we get a lot of sugar most days of our lives. And so it's such ubiquitous substance because of the food supply that we currently have. So what impact do you think this sugar excess, because there's no doubt that there's a sugar excess in the UK, statistics suggest 45 kilos per person per year. In the States, it's a little bit higher, getting closer to 60 kilos per person per year. And I'm sure many other Western countries are the same. It's a huge intake that we are getting. What impact do you think this is having on our health? Could you list a few things that you think are becoming a problem because of that?
Yeah, I mean, it is very interesting, the statistics, isn't it? And there's even, if you look at trends now of obesity versus sugar intake, we're starting to see a tapering off of sugar intake, where people, I guess, through the media, through the press, are becoming very aware that it's important to try and reduce sugar intake, and yet there is still a rise in levels of overweight and obesity. So, there is some evidence there to suggest that you can't just pin a specific health problem on one nutrient, as you said at the start. We've done in the past with fat, and now we're trying to do that with sugar. And I think what unanimously you see in the research is that the biggest factor that causes problems for health is being overweight and inactive. And I know that's not sexy, and it's not exciting for people always to try and recognize that, because we want to know new and exciting stuff. But if you're overweight and you're taking in more calories than you need for your metabolism and your energy requirements, then you'll begin to accumulate weight and excess body fat. And that is the key problem. That's the core problem, the root of a lot of health problems. So sugar being hyperpalatable, as we've mentioned, and those stats that you've thrown out there, are suggesting we are taking on a lot of energy that we perhaps don't need. And whenever I talk to my clients about sugar and carbohydrates as a category overall, my general advice to them is scale the amount of sugar and carbohydrates you have to the amount of exercise that you're doing. Because what you've got to think about, again, is this idea of step back. And we ask our question, right, we know what proteins do. Proteins are super important. Every sort of cell in the body is made up of proteins. You need adequate protein all of the time, and you can't store it. So you've got to keep that coming in at the right level. And whilst we can store fat, perhaps that's something that should be, eaten in moderation, but we need fats for various structures and hormones and things in the body. And carbohydrates are predominantly there. Whilst they have some roles for structure in the body, and they're important for the formation of things like DNA, we need to make sure that we scale carbohydrate and sugar intake against energy needs. So if you're someone that is relatively sedentary, or even if you exercise, but I think we have to be quite honest with ourselves here. If you're only doing 1 or 2 sessions in the gym a week, that doesn't really justify having huge amounts of carbohydrate and sugar coming in through nutrition. Now, if you're an athlete and you're out on your bike doing 3-4 hour sessions multiple times per week, that's exactly why in sports nutrition we have, those fast acting energy gels. Why? And this is an interesting area for me, is that if you are an athlete and you've got to get a lot of energy back into the system, that's where we would promote for some athletes to eat less than healthy foods, such as cereals, such as, covering a bowl of Cocoa Pops with milk. Now, there's always better options from a health perspective, but if you eat in a healthy way, going back to what we said before, you're likely to feel full quite quickly. And if you're likely to feel full quickly, you can't get the energy in to support the amount of energy you need to recover and go again on your next session. Yeah. So this is almost if a regular person is doing this, where they're eating hyperpalatable foods, cereals, lots of refined processed foods that have loads of sugar in them, then what that's doing is it's making it very easy to get those calories in. If you're not burning those calories, you're not scaling the amount of carbohydrate relative to your energy needs, you'll accumulate body weight. When you accumulate body weight, that leads to all those cascade of health problems. And ironically, at the heart of all of the health problems that lead to diabetes and heart disease is this thing, insulin resistance. And a lot of people think that having sugar will cause us problems that would lead to diabetes, but it's not always for the reason people think. It's because we're getting overweight, because we're accumulating lots of fat, because we're in an energy surplus, and because sugar is easy to eat, that can contribute to that. And therefore, the insulin resistance isn't necessarily coming as a result of eating sugar and its effect on the pancreas and how it produces insulin. It's coming because we're getting over fat. The fat's releasing hormones and various cytokines and chemicals that create problems of insulin resistance. It's overloading the liver. That's the heart of the problem, excuse the pun. And then the added sugar on top of that is just compounding those challenges. So I think I've gone off on one a little bit there, mate. Sorry.
That's all right. No. You raised some really good, some good points that I'd like to address, actually. I think, this concept of eating carbohydrates and sugar being one of those potential carbohydrates to meet the energy demands that relate to exercise. I think that's so key, because I've seen so many people who, like you say, are really kind of recreational exercisers. maybe 2, possibly 3 short sessions a week, sort of like 30 or 40-minute workouts, and yet they're eating in a manner that would make you think that they're an endurance athlete who's training 6 times a week doing 2 hours a session. And you know, that just, as you said, that creates a surplus of carbohydrate energy that has to be dealt with somehow, and your body's going to drive that into storage, just like any food, fat, protein that we eat in surplus. And so I think that's a really important point. And I also liked what you said there about insulin resistance, because if we are eating carbohydrates and sugar in an excess, then the body is going to start resisting the impact of that, and it will start to shunt those excess fuels into fat storage, which just, as you said, further promotes even more insulin resistance.
Yep. Well put. And that's exactly the challenge. I think when we look at helping clients from a practical perspective, you know, I really like to make sure that people start with eating the right amount of protein. I just feel people, you know, the lay person, our regular clients as personal trainers that we see, don't eat enough protein. And so addressing that first is a great way to automatically start to reduce the amount of sugar and perhaps refined carbs that you have, because when you're eating more protein, that's using up more of your calorie allotment. We already mentioned earlier that protein is quite good at making you feel full. And also protein has quite a high thermic effect of food. So if you're eating protein in adequate amounts, you're actually burning a significant amount of that energy allotment from protein, versus where we're having a lot more carbohydrates, where we're using less energy as a result. So the thermic effect of protein is about 25 to 30% of the energy from that protein being used in digestive and metabolic processes. Carbs, maybe 6 to 8%, fat 2 to 3%. So by increasing protein, it helps you to automatically self-regulate your weight a little bit. And then I think really what it comes down to is starting to coach the importance of recognizing what whole foods are instead of processed foods, because then by eating more whole foods, we start to reduce the simple refined sugars. We take in more fiber, we take in more water, more micronutrients, and that again starts to self-regulate the overall amount of energy that we take in. And if we can start to, you know, go full circle, modify our body weight to be more in line with, you know, a normal body mass index and healthy body fat levels, we start to reduce the risk of the big diseases. So I think that's always the key thing. You know, going back to what this talk is about, it's about sugar, but it's about the bigger picture in where sugar sits.
Let's use that as a springboard to get into a couple of other thought processes. First of all, we've kind of been touching on this, but maybe not directly addressed it. So let's go with the subject of sugar and the role that sugar plays in the obesity epidemic that we are currently observing over the last 20 years. Obviously, we've kind of touched on this concept that it's not the only factor, but can you try to quantify or suggest the role in which sugar is playing in this current problem?
Yeah, simply, I think the most important thing that has been borne out in the research really recently, and there's some quite, I mean, it's taken a real turn research in obesity recently, where we've actually got some really good sort of quite strong clinical trials in metabolic wards where we've been able to tightly regulate how much people are eating, the ratios of carbs, fats, and proteins that are being eaten. And relatively consistently in the last 5 or 10 years, we've seen some good studies that have shown, even if you have a high fat diet versus low carb, or a high carb diet versus low fat, providing that protein is equated between those studies and the individual is either in a surplus if they want to gain weight, they're in a deficit if they want to lose weight, it doesn't much matter what the ratio of those carbohydrates and fats are. Whatever works for that person is typically the advice that you see these days. So if you're someone that can regulate their energy intake and their calorie intake better by having more carbs because you feel they make you full, then fine, absolutely. There's not to say that biochemical individuality doesn't play a part here. And if carbs make you feel more full and you enjoy eating them and they just seem to work better for you, then a higher carb diet might be more appropriate for you. And equally the other way, you know, a higher fat diet might work better. So I think,
can I just clarify on that? When you say use the word full, and I'm just mindful that there's two definitions here. Are we talking about physically feeling full? I've eaten a lot and now my stomach is mechanically increased in size, or are we talking about that feeling of satiation of now I feel satisfied because of what I've eaten and I don't want to eat anymore?
Yeah, well, both. So satiation mostly. And I think that's the importance, again, of having the right amount of protein there, making sure that's the number one priority. And then outside of that, once we know we're hitting our protein needs, the next most important thing is making sure that within the realms of the right amount of energy coming in, the correct energy balance, carbs and fats ratios don't matter that much. That's what the research is telling us these days. And I think that's when you then start to say, well, okay, if I exercise a lot in the week, I like my resistance training, I like to do a lot of cardio that requires more energy from carbohydrates because carbohydrates support high intensity exercise and they're a pretty important fuel source, then great, we need more carbs. And if we're more sedentary, then we might look to even out the amount of fat and carbs we have, but still focus on that protein requirement. So to ask this question, well, how does sugar have a role in the weight gain and obesity epidemic? It comes back to the fact that sugar is a carbohydrate. The amount of carbohydrate sits in the framework of having the right ratios of protein, fat, but this all sits under the umbrella of how are we meeting our energy needs? And theoretically, you could have a pretty poor diet with lots of crap in it, but you can still lose weight. And there's some research to show that, that can happen. You can still lose weight providing you're in an energy deficit, but it's not going to be fun. It's going to be hard because you're not eating the foods that help regulate energy intake. You're eating foods that actually promote the chances that you'll eat more. So to lose weight under those circumstances is very difficult. And it all comes back to then helping our clients understand what good quality food is, what's a whole food versus a processed food, and how to be aware of these hyper palatable food combinations that exist, which ones are high in sugar, because that will result in us taking in excess energy that can contribute to overweight and obesity.
I think that's such a good point, Richard. I think a lot of people miss when they hear that discussion point. I've heard that as well, that if you eat a poor quality diet, but you control for calories, you can still lose weight. But what is not being controlled in that poor quality diet that is limited in calories is appetite. So it's pretty likely if you're eating garbage food, your appetite and your cravings are going to be rocketing through the roof, but you're being encouraged to keep those calories down so you can lose weight. I mean, you can't think of a more nightmarish type of diet to be on. I'm eating food that's constantly making me hungry and driving me to eat more, but I have to try and limit it. That's just a pure battle of willpower that's, as you suggested, highly likely to fail. Why not just switch the dietary type away from these energy-dense foods that are rich in sugar and other processed foods and eat foods that are satiating and make it easy not to feel the need to eat? And then you can control for calories in a much more simple manner.
Exactly that. And when we talk about clients that don't want to track calories, count calories, weigh everything out, and that's most people. I mean, I'll be honest, I don't do that. I don't want to do that. I haven't got time to weigh all my food out. I'm not competing in some kind of bodybuilding competition or physique competition. That's not necessary for me. But for clients that just don't have the time to do that, as trainers, we work in the real world where people don't have that time. And some might want to do it. But what we then have to do is think about how can we help them self-regulate. So through our coaching and our advice, we have to give practical advice that automatically helps to self-regulate energy intake. And that is doing all the things we've spoken about, having correct amounts of protein, lots of fiber, lots of water through whole foods, lots of micronutrients. There's even I've seen some research papers to suggest that if we're devoid of micronutrients, there are signals within the body that will stimulate you as an organism to go out and find those nutrients. And inadvertently, you might overeat and take in more calories than you need, not because you're hungry for energy, but you're hungry for those nutrients. So that's a little bit more out there, but there's intuitively that would make sense that if you're deficient in something, you may get a signal to go out and find that. So helping our clients tick all those boxes means that their chances of overeating and indulging in those high sugar foods are all the more less. So this big discussion of sugar really always needs to come back into the context of who's the client, how can we best help them, what are they not currently doing, and if we can coach them through this process of self-regulating energy intake, then overweight and obesity should effectively take care of itself and not be an issue.
Great stuff. Now we're kind of coming up on time, but I might be opening a can of worms here, but I'm going to ask us one final question because I think it's key in this discussion. We've been talking a lot there about real food, and perhaps one of the primary sources of sugar in real food, as you mentioned earlier, is fruit. And fruit, you'd think would be straightforward, because generally we just are told fruit and veg is good for us, and most people accept that. But fruit is also tends to be quite high in one of the richer sources of a type of sugar called fructose.
Mm.
Now, and with that, some research, as I'm sure you're aware, Richard, suggests that there are problems associated with fructose consumption. Now, some of the positives, and this is why fructose was pushed some years ago, is that fructose has a very low glycemic index, only about 19 or 20, and so therefore the sugars get into the bloodstream slowly. But that there's, and with that, it's usually used as a justification to eat more fructose. But I'm wondering if you can maybe try to help unfold this. I mean, is fructose okay? Is it good? Or are there some problems that we should be concerned about with certain populations?
Yeah, man, I think it's a really tough question to answer. And going back to your point about why does fructose get into the blood more slowly? I mean, the liver is the primary organ dealing with fructose. 90 to 100% of the fructose we eat has got to go through the liver. But I guess to take a step back.
So that slows it down because it has that longer route to travel rather than going straight into the blood.
Yeah, absolutely. The liver's got to package that up and decide what it wants to do with it. And the interesting thing is that the liver has, if we talk about glucose versus fructose, they're effectively the same molecule. They're slightly different shape. They're still made of 6 carbons. They're 4 calories each. The molecular formula is not too dissimilar at all. Mm-hmm. But the way the body handles them is quite different, because the liver will have, based on its energy needs, the liver will say, okay, I can take as much glucose in as I need. If I need more energy, then I'll absorb that glucose and make sure my own carbohydrate stores are stocked up. And then so I get first shot at the glucose, and then I'll pass that out to all the other tissues that need it. Mm-hmm. And then it can shut down to glucose after that. It can almost make itself to some extent resistant and say, okay, I'm done. I don't need any more glucose. Let the rest of the body take care of that. But with fructose, that doesn't happen. It doesn't seem to have like a door to shut against fructose. Right. All of the fructose that comes in is just going to continuously be coming into the liver. Now, a little bit is going to be useful. The body can convert some of that fructose into glucose and store it. But what the liver is going to do is that it's going to start packaging that fructose up, and any extra glucose as well is going to package that all up, and then it's going to send it out in the cholesterol carrier molecules around the body, and then the different cells and tissues can start extracting that. So if we're talking about fructose that comes from a whole food source like fruit actually will have a fairly even amount. I mean, it depends on the fruit. You can pick some fruits that are higher in fructose than glucose, but overall, across the board, fruit has a relatively even amount of glucose and fructose, and overall, the absolute amount of sugar in fruit is probably not going to bother people's health. Whereas, let's just compare that to, say, a can of Coke, energy drinks, some of the big, soft drinks that are loaded with high fructose corn syrup, with sugar, with all these different forms of sugar that exist. They are the things that will become problematic, because you'll drink one of those, it will get into the system so quickly. There's nothing to slow it down. There's no fiber. There's no other nutrients. It's going to get straight in. Within 30 minutes, that's going to be pounding your liver. The liver's going to go, holy crap, there's all this, fructose here. What do I do with it? I don't need this much. It's going to start trying to package it up. It's going to send it out into the blood in the cholesterol carriers, and it's going to start increasing. The liver will start to increase its amount of triglycerides, its fats, as well as these cholesterol carriers. And when we go to things like diabetes and heart disease risk, you look at things like the triglycerides in the blood, you look at the ratios of the different types of cholesterol, and then you start to assign risk against someone's health based on these values that you're reading. So if you're someone that is glooping down a whole load of these processed drinks that are super high in sugars, especially fructose, that's when it becomes a problem, because it overloads the liver, and the liver's got to do something with it. And worst case scenario, the liver can start to become insulin resistant, and that's when you get a whole host of problems, especially if you're overweight as well. But I think if you're just talking about 2, 3, 4 pieces of fruit a day, and you're a relatively healthy person, you're not overweight to any extent, that really shouldn't be a concern. And so for anyone that thinks, I need to reduce my fruit intake because of the fructose, the natural sugars that are in there, God, is that going to be problematic for me? don't fret about it. Don't do that, because the fruit has more good stuff in there
Sure.
than is worth worrying about. What you need to do is make sure that you're not drinking your calories and getting in all the processed sugars in high amounts that will bombard the liver, and then that's when fructose becomes a big challenge and a problem for health.
You raise a good point there. Maybe just to try and summarize. So we're saying that if somebody is very overweight or obese, that there's clearly signs of insulin resistance there, maybe problems already with cholesterol, that taking in large amounts of sugar and maybe even sometimes those higher fructose fruits could be a problem for them because the environment is different inside their body. Whereas if you're an individual who weight's not really an issue, they're fairly healthy, we should not be trying to limit fructose intake via fruit. We should be primarily worrying about, liquid soft drinks that carry a lot of that fructose in it. Is that what we're saying?
Exactly that. Well put, mate. And it just ties back to the idea that if you're drinking a load of that stuff, you're taking in a shed load of extra calories anyway.
Yeah.
And therefore you're back to the original problem of promoting weight gain alongside probably influencing these negative metabolic markers of high triglycerides in the blood, altered cholesterol levels. And you're really, you're almost bringing about what we would call metabolic syndrome by altering all these variety of factors that if a doctor looks at you and says, well, you're overweight, your waist circumference is raised, you've got high blood triglycerides, maybe cholesterol's up, blood pressure might be up as well. You've now got metabolic syndrome, and you are now at probably 2 or 3 times greater risk of type 2 diabetes and heart disease. So you can see how these things and these factors feed in. And therefore that's pretty important to keep that in context. The person, are they healthy or are they already unhealthy, slightly overweight? Okay, if they're overweight, a little bit unhealthy, we definitely want to limit the overall amount of processed sugars and maybe fructose as well. Healthy person, exercising, normal weight, no problem at all for fruit. I'd almost go as far to say have as much as you like, because I'm sure the micronutrient content in the fruit would far outweigh any potential health problems that are presented with the fructose content. And just to finish on that note, mate, I looked up a little study on this a little while ago, and there was a study in a research journal called The Paradoxical Effect of Fruit on Obesity. Can I read the one little line from that for you? I found it really interesting, yeah. So it's 2016, and it says, previous studies of the effects of fruit on obesity have shown that their anti-obesity effects are greater than their pro-obesity effects in most cases, as demonstrated in this review. Moreover, the final outcomes of these anti-obesity studies support the inclusion of high amounts of fruit in our daily food intake to reduce weight, as well as promote a healthy lifestyle by increasing physical activity and reducing the intake of sugar and fat. However, most types of fruit contain large amounts of simple sugars, which are well-known contributory factors to obesity and obesity-related diseases. Therefore, the high level of intake of particular forms of fruit, such as fruit juice, is not advisable in certain age groups, especially children. In addition, it has been suggested that plant fiber and phytochemicals may be responsible for the anti-obesity effects of fruit. So what I take from that is that fructose is not something to be worried about if you're getting it from fruit, because it can have anti-obesity effects, despite the fact that there are lots of simple sugars there. Lots of research papers are telling us it can actually help promote a healthy weight and even weight loss. And I don't think we know exactly why that is. And it's likely to do with perhaps the fiber, the phytonutrient chemicals and compounds within that. Perhaps we're yet to discover exactly why fruit would specifically help us to regulate our body weight, even though it's got a lot of natural sugars in there.
Yeah. I think that's I'm really pleased to hear that they said in that review that fruit juice is potentially a problem because it removes the fiber, takes a lot of that potential goodness out of it. A quick thought though that you've raised there, and then we're going to have to wrap up because we're on time, is that if we think about some fruits, there are fruits that have a much higher fructose content than high fructose corn syrup. High fructose corn syrup is 45 glucose, 55 fructose. There's fruits out there that have fructose levels up at 70%. But the difference is the volume of energy that's being consumed. If I was to drink a typical can of soft drink that's sweetened with high fructose corn syrup, the amount of sugar in there is probably 3 to 4 times the volume of a typical apple or a pear. So we're getting a huge amount of energy in a very quick, short time that hits the body, as you said, particularly the liver, very, very hard. Eating whole fruit is just not the same. We cannot compare the two.
Yeah,
Richard, any final comments there before we wrap up?
No, I totally agree with you. And as you were just saying that, I was just flicking for the name of someone that's done a lot of research in this area, and that's Dr. Kimber Stanhope at the University of California, Davis. And she's got some interesting studies, which I think make it hard for us to be conclusive one way or the other what the role of fructose is on the body, because she's done some research to show that even where calories are equated and we don't lose or gain body weight, fructose in high amounts can still have some quite negative effects within the body with respect to those blood markers of triglycerides and cholesterol. Whereas other researchers and experts are saying, well, fructose really isn't that much of a problem if our weight is being controlled. So I think there's a little bit of not conflict, but I think there just needs to be more research on this. But I think what we can conclusively say is exactly what you summarized there, is that it's the amount and the palatability and the ease at which that can come in, and fruit just simply, you've got to go at it and eat lots of apples in one go to start causing problems. And who can and who wants to eat 10 apples in a row?
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, Richard, it's been such a pleasure having you on today. And it sounds to me like we actually have probably twice as much content still to talk about. I appreciate your time and your expertise, and I hope that you have a great low sugar day.
Same to you, mate. Thanks a lot, Ben, as always.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and share via social media. You can also rate the show on iTunes, Stitcher, or YouTube. If you'd like to know more about us, then check out our range of online courses at www.nordicfitnesseducation.com.